And since we talked about this earlier in the production section, I wanted to make sure that in the post-production section, we talk about how to edit when you're using multiple tracks from different speakers. So there are a couple things that could happen for you to find yourself in this scenario, and it's very, very common. It's either done by multi-track recording, so I'm using the Rodecaster Pro. If I'm using multi-track and I have a few people in the room with me, we can all have our audio recorded to a separate track, and then you can bring it in and it will look like this. But this is also what it could look like if you used one of the services that we talked about in the production section. Maybe you used Riverside FM and you got the files from your show and now you have multiple tracks. Or maybe you did what we talked about and you recorded on your end, your guest or your co-host recorded on their end and sent you the files. Either way, now you've got two files at least of your voice and their voice. In this case, I'm playing the part of both people on the show, which is sort of sad and lonely, but it's okay. And so we're going to start by doing some of the same stuff that we did in the last section when we talked about cutting, trimming, and fading. I'm going to put in an intro song. We'll pretend that this is the intro for this podcast. In this case, we put speaker 1, which would be me as the host on the top track, and the guest is on the second track. So I'm going to line up where I want myself to start talking. Hello, and I'll fade it in just like we talked about. And this looks a little loud, so I'm going to turn it down a little bit. Hello and welcome. There we go. So now we've got the intro timing down. But what you'll notice when you're working with multiple tracks is that they fit together kind of like puzzle pieces. If I line these up this way, you can see this little bit of audio here is the host, and the bigger audio is when the guest is actually speaking. In my case, I was recording with two microphones right next to each other, so there was a lot of bleed between the different tracks. But if you're recording remotely, you're probably not going to see any of that. You're just going to see blank line and then speech and then blank line and then speech. But either way, they fit in pretty directly. The first thing to do is just sort of adjust timing. So where the host stops talking here is me. Hello. So I want the guest to start talking in a way that feels natural. Yes, today is me. Hello. How is it going? There we go. So that's where I'm going to start. In this case, I was in the same room, so there was no delay. Me. Hello. How is it going? So I can kind of just sync it up. I have this weird echo thing happening now. Hello. How is it going? Thank you for having me. And in other cases, especially when you're recording remotely, you might notice a bit of a delay. You ask someone like, how are you doing today? And then there's sort of like just long enough of a delay that it feels awkward, and you kind of need to tighten things up a little bit. But now what I want to do here is use the cut tool to cut out the part where I'm not talking, so we get rid of that echo. And it should be a clean transition from one person, which is just me, to the other person, which is also just me. It's me. Hello, how is it going? Thank you for having me here. I'm honored to be a part of this show. Yes, and the dog barked because he was so excited. So that's working. Now what you notice though is there is some overlap. So if I zoom in here, you can see that there's some overlap here, and that's going to keep that background noise, that room tone consistent throughout. So you're not going to hear the cuts between the different tracks. Today is me. Hello, how? And of course, I could even take this a step further by fading each of these out. It depends how much time you want to put into this. But what I can say, though, is if you leave spaces in between this, it will be noticeable. This show? Yes. So if you listen carefully there, you can hear the audio cut out and cut back in because these tracks are not lined up and there's a space right there. Show? Yes. And if you do that every single time the conversation shifts, that's going to get really distracting, so it's always something you want to avoid. And the easiest way to avoid it is just to make sure things overlap. And like I said, you can adjust timing a little bit. Yes, and the dog barked because he was so excited. Now, in this case, for this example, what I'm doing is basically just cutting out anytime the other person is talking. So now I've got my show roughly edited, and you can see it's basically like puzzle pieces back and forth. Just a side note, I've learned to become a better interviewer by editing this way, because when you're done, you can see literally who is speaking more on which track. And I always try to make it so that my guest has more on their track than I do. Because if I'm the one talking most of the time, that's probably not going to be the best interview. I want the guest to have most of the dialogue on their end and less of the dialogue on my end. And so that works. And then I can even bring back in this bumper music, do what we talked about last time. turn the volume down a little bit, fade it in, fade this out. The dog is whining. The end. And we'll fade it in here. Our dog gets nervous when I talk to myself, so you can hear him whining in the background because the dog is whining. The end. And there we go. There is our whole episode. So when you're working with multiple tracks, this is kind of basically what you're going to end up with. We've got the music bookending on either side, and we've got a dialogue going back and forth. Again, this is only a minute long, so yours could be an hour or 2 hours or something like that. And you might have more than 2 tracks, maybe you have 4 tracks. You might want to play music during your show if you want something in the background. So in that case, you'd have a music track that's in the middle right there. You know, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but this is sort of the basic to cut between it. Now, one other thing to keep in mind is that you don't always have to delete every single thing while somebody else is talking. So when we talk in conversation, we're constantly acknowledging each other. If you're talking to me, I'm probably sitting here going, yeah, huh. And I'm like making kind of reactions to let you know how I'm feeling about what you're saying, that I'm engaged with what you're saying. But those things in a podcast episode can actually end up being distracting. So usually you want to get rid of those so that way it doesn't take away from what the other person is saying, but it doesn't mean you have to get rid of all of them. For example, right here, this person makes a point and this person agrees with him. Wow, that is super smart. If you had a course, I think I would take. Sometimes there's nothing wrong with just like leaving a few of those in. So it's not that it has to be total dead silence on the other end when somebody is talking, but you want to use a very fine touch when it comes to bringing in sort of those affirmations and those acknowledgments and those reactions that we naturally have when we're having a conversation. And it becomes strange because the more that you do interviews, the more you become aware of that different way of speaking where in a natural conversation, it makes sense that I would always be reacting to what you're saying. But sometimes as you gain more experience as a podcast interviewer, you'll ask someone a question and then you'll find yourself consciously being quiet, which can feel awkward because sometimes they're not getting the feedback they're used to in a conversation. It's just one of those things that takes practice to navigate, but it is something to be aware of that if somebody's talking during an interview and the other person is constantly making noises and interrupting them, it can end up being very distracting. And during the editing process is a good chance for you to clean that up and eliminate it a little bit. And now we've got our multi-track episode here ready to go. Before we jump into how to save and export, I have been using music in both of these examples. So up next, let's talk about how to include music legally into your podcast.